Hello, everybody. I'm Anthony Kay, and welcome back to Engineered Coffee. Last week on Coffee Buzz, I promised that this week we'd take a closer look at roasting. And when you think about it, roasting is probably the single biggest transformation that happens to coffee. We start with a small, hard green seed that doesn't really smell or taste anything like the coffee we know. We apply heat for perhaps 10 or 12 minutes, and it becomes brown, brittle, aromatic, and packed with hundreds of compounds that ultimately create the flavor in your cup. So today we're going to follow a coffee bean through the roaster and look what's actually happening. Because roasting isn't simply heating coffee until it turns brown. It is heat transfer, mass transfer, and chemistry, all happening at the same time. So let's fire up the roaster. Before we can understand roasting, we need to understand what we're putting into the machine. A green coffee bean is actually the seed of the coffee cherry, and importantly, it isn't completely dry. Green coffee typically contains roughly 8 to 12% moisture. That moisture is extremely important because one of the first jobs of the roasting process is to drive as much moisture of it out. But the green bean also contains carbohydrates, proteins, amino acids, lipids, acids, and sugars. Think of these as our raw ingredients. The species and variety of coffee determine part of what we start with. Where and how it was grown matters. How it was processed matters. How it was stored matters. All of those things have already influenced the green bean before it ever reaches the roaster. But now it's the roaster's job to unlock that potential. So the roaster is preheated and the green beans are dropped, or charged is the general term used, into the roasting chamber. Immediately, something interesting happens. The temperature inside the roaster drops sharply because those relatively cool green beans absorb a large amount of thermal energy. This is basic thermodynamics. Heat is moving from the hot roasting environment into the cooler bean. At first, the coffee is predominantly absorbing energy. The bean temperature rises and the water trapped inside begins moving and evaporating. This early part of the roast is generally referred to as the drying phase. Now, after several minutes, something you can actually see begins to happen. The beans change from green to pale green and eventually yellow. And if you were standing next to the roaster, the smell would start changing as well. It doesn't really smell like roasted coffee yet. At this stage, it can smell more like hay, grass, or even freshly baked bread. I think cereal sometimes. Water vapor is leaving the bean. The physical structure is beginning to change, and the thin outer skin, called the silver skin, begins separating from the bean and becomes what roasters call chaff. Now we're approaching the really interesting chemistry. As the bean continues heating, it begins turning brown. One of the major reasons is something called the Maillard reaction. This isn't unique to coffee. It's the same broad family of chemical reactions responsible for the browning of bread crust, roasted meat, and many other cooked foods. In simple terms, reducing sugars react with amino compounds under heat. The result is an extraordinary complicated network of reactions producing color, flavor, and aroma compounds. This is where that unmistakable roasted coffee character really starts developing. Nutty flavors, chocolate notes, roasted aromas, and eventually hundreds of different volatile compounds. This is why roasting is so much more complicated than simply selecting a temperature. The time matters, the temperature matters, and perhaps most importantly, the relationship between the two matters. Now, here's the next part is what I particularly like from an engineering perspective. As roasting continues, the water vapor and gases are being generated and they are being released inside the bean. At the same time, the structure of the bean is changing and expanding. The pressure begins building internally. So for a brief period, you can almost think of every coffee bean as a tiny little pressure vessel. The bean is getting hotter, it's expanding, and gases are trying to escape. Its cellular structure is becoming increasingly fragile. Eventually, the internal pressure and structural changes become too much, and then crack. Roasters call this the first crack. If you've never heard it, it sounds remarkably similar to popcorn popping. The beans expand and their cellular structure fractures as pressure is released. This is one of the most important landmarks during roasting because it tells the roaster that the coffee has entered a critical part of its development. And from this point onwards, seconds really matter. Stop relatively soon after the first crack, and you'll generally have a lighter roast, what people call light roast coffee. Continue developing the coffee, and the color becomes darker, acidity generally decreases, and roast-derived flavors become increasingly dominant. Keep going far enough, and eventually you'll reach something called the second crack. By then, you're firmly moving into the dark roast territory. Now, the period after first crack is usually called the development phase. And this is where the skill of the roaster becomes particularly important. They are balancing sweetness, acidity, body, aroma, and roast character. Too little development and the coffee can taste grassy, sour, or underdeveloped. Too much, and you start destroying the characteristics that made that particular coffee interesting in the first place. Eventually, everything begins to taste, well, like roast. And this is something consumers sometimes misunderstand. A very dark roast isn't necessarily a stronger or better coffee. It's simply coffee that has been roasted further. At some point, you're tasting less of the origin and more of the roasting process itself. And here is another fascinating part. During roasting, the coffee bean physically expands, and at exactly the same time, it gets lighter. Depending on the green coffee and the roast profile, somewhere around 12 to 20% of the original mass can disappear during roasting. Much of that is water, together with the carbon dioxide and other volatile materials generated or released during the process. Now let's put that into manufacturing terms. Imagine we buy 100 kilograms of coffee, of green coffee, let's say €6 a kilo. That's 600 euros worth of green coffee. If we have a 15% roast loss, those 100 kilograms become only 85 kilograms of roasted coffee. That means our €6 per kilogram green coffee has effectively become approximately €7.06 per kilogram of roasted coffee. Before we've ground it, before we've packaged it, and before we've done anything else. If the roast loss reaches 20%, we're left with only 80 kilograms. Our effective coffee cost is now €7.50 per kilo. Now multiply a difference like that across thousands or millions of kilograms of coffee, and suddenly a few percentage points become a very serious amount of money. So roast loss isn't simply an interesting number for the roaster, it's yield. And in manufacturing, the yield is money. Eventually, we've reached exactly the roast profile we want, but we now have another engineering problem. How do we stop it? The beans have left the roasting chamber, but they're still extremely hot and contain a considerable amount of thermal energy. If we do nothing, they'll simply continue roasting. So we need to remove the heat quickly and consistently. One method is rapid air cooling, but particularly on larger industrial roasting systems, you may also encounter what's called water quenching. A carefully controlled amount of water is introduced at the end of the roast. The water absorbs the thermal energy quickly, and it heats and evaporates, helping arrest the roasting process. And the important words there are carefully controlled. We're not trying to make the coffee wet. we're using the water as part of the thermal control process. And too little, and we may not stop the roast as quickly as we intended. And too much, we can influence the final moisture content and potentially the quality and stability of the coffee. So once again, something that sounds incredibly simple becomes another controlled process variable. Now remember that our green coffee started at somewhere around 8 to 12% of moisture. After roasting, that has fallen dramatically. Depending on the coffee and roast process, roasted coffee will commonly finish somewhere around roughly 1 to 5% moisture. And this isn't something we simply assume. We measure it. In our operation, the moisture content is checked on every batch of roasted coffee. Why? Because the moisture tells us something about what happened during the roast, but it can also affect what happens afterwards. It influences the stability, the grinding behavior, extraction, and shelf life, and ultimately the consistency of the finished product. So we're certainly not looking at a brown coffee bean saying, that looks about right. We are actually measuring it. And that brings us to another important measurement, the color. We casually describe coffee as a light roast, a medium roast, or a dark roast, but those descriptions are subjective. What I call medium dark might be what somebody else thinks simply dark, and that's not good enough in manufacturing. So the coffee industry uses instruments to measure roast color objectively. One commonly known system is the Agtrin scale, although there are other color measurement systems used throughout the industry. Broadly speaking, a higher Agtrin number represents a lighter coffee, and a lower number represents a darker roast. And interestingly, color can be measured on both the whole bean and also the ground coffee. That gives us another window into what happened during the roasting process. Because two batches can look almost identical to the human eye, but measurement may tell us something very different. Again, in our operation, color is one of the parameters we check to make sure the coffee we produced matches the specification. And this brings us to something I don't think people outside industrial coffee always appreciate. A roast isn't simply roast this coffee medium. A properly controlled roast has measurable parameters. We can look at the time, the temperature, the rate of temperature change, airflow, weight loss, final moisture, color, and ultimately sensory performance in the cup. At industrial scale, consistency matters enormously. If someone buys the same coffee tomorrow, they expect it to taste like the coffee they bought today. And if we're manufacturing millions of capsules or packs, small process variations can quickly become very large quality problems. That's ultimately what process control is about. So now we've taken our green coffee, removed much of its moisture, changed its physical structure, created hundreds of aroma compounds, developed its color, checked the roast loss, measured the final moisture, and verified the color against specification. Is the job done? Unfortunately not, because almost immediately another process begins, degassing. Freshly roasted coffee begins releasing significant amounts of carbon dioxide. At the same time, many of these wonderful aroma compounds we've just created are volatile, and oxygen, moisture, and time are now our enemies, which is exactly where packaging enters the story. The roaster has spent perhaps 10 minutes creating those flavors and aromas. Our job in packaging is to protect them for the next several months or even a year. And that's why oxygen barriers, moisture barriers, and nitrogen flushing and good packaging designs matter so much. The moment roasting finishes, the race to preserve the freshness begins. So I think roasting is a perfect example of what makes coffee such an extraordinary product. On the surface, it looks simple. Green beans go in, we apply some heat, brown beans come out. But underneath that, apparently simple process is thermodynamics, heat transfer, mass transfer, pressure, chemistry, and extremely precise process control. And importantly, we can measure it. Roast loss, moisture, color, time, temperature. Every measurement gives us another piece of information about what happened inside the bean. Change the temperature, change the airflow, change the drum speed, change the time, change the quench, change the green coffee, and you can produce an entirely different result. That's not simply cooking, that's engineering. And well, that's it for this week's Engineered Coffee. Next Sunday we'll be back taking another quick look at what's happening around the world of coffee. And remember, coffee isn't just a drink. It's agriculture, it's chemistry, it's engineering, it's logistics, and it's millions of people around the world working together to produce one perfect cup. I'm Anthony Kay, and this has been Engineered Coffee. If you like this episode, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who may be interested. Stay curious and keep engineering better coffee.